Today we're going to be looking at the rules of composition and focus points that's going to help you and enable you to create more balanced and engaging images. Stay tuned. Yes mate, thanks for tuning in. I'm Renato, and as always this show is powered by conceptstart.net, the place where you can go for some instant art inspiration. So today we're going to be looking at composition and focus points and basically how to deliver our image, our artworks in the best possible way so we can manipulate, if we want to use that word, or I would say control the way in which the viewer looks at our image, and we guide them throughout the image intentionally. So intent is probably one of the key words to associate with composition. So by now, if you've been through the rest of the crash course, you should be at a point where you can draw well and draw in perspective. Yeah, you kind of up to a standard, and so composition for me is probably one of the final things to try and understand and master, and essentially be in full control of the drawing and how it's delivered and perceived by the viewer. It's kind of inherent in us. We instinctively know what's well composed and what's badly composed, and the badly composed images turn us off straight away, whereas the well composed images turn us on and entice us and make us want to stay and be entertained by the image. Good composition is often associated with things found in nature, so I'm just going to go through some rules right now. The Fibonacci sequence is a series of numbers where a number is found by adding up the two numbers before it. Coincidentally, this principle is verified by a completely different principle seen throughout nature, the golden ratio. By definition, the golden ratio is a special number found by dividing a line into two parts so that the longer part divided by the smaller part is also equal to the whole length divided by the longer part. This special number pi 1.681 is the ratio used by nature when dividing or multiplying organic matter. The rule of thirds isn't an exclusive rule as such, but it's an ideal tool used for good composition by placing key elements on intersection cross points when the image is broken down by a 3x3 grid of 9 equal parts. The photos on screen are being adjusted accordingly to work with the rule of thirds. Can you notice a difference when something specific is placed on one of these intersection points? The image in general seems to have context because now we know where to look. The rule of thirds is a great go-to guide, and it can really help push an image. Since 3 is the magic number, there's also the rule of odds, which is linked to the rule of thirds. It's an unwritten rule, but it's believed that an odd number of subjects is more engaging than an even number of subjects. If you have more than one subject in your picture, the suggestion is to choose an arrangement with at least 3 subjects, and usually just 3, since 5, 7 or more just becomes visual clutter. The middle line is a composition rule that cuts the frame in half, either vertically or horizontally. The focus point is usually placed somewhere along this line, and the visuals either side of this line are balanced accordingly. It's not the type of composition to be used all of the time, but can be effective when placing key elements along this centre line and generally dividing the composition and breaking it down. So what is composition? Composition is the act of combining parts or elements to form a whole. So the goal of good composition is basically to intentionally arrange these elements and parts of your drawing in a way that better engages with the audience and sustains their interest to elicit a certain response. We want to keep the viewer engaged and present within the image, and by perfecting or mastering these principles of composition, we are able to do that. And on a psychological level now, we're working behind the scenes. So we need to understand what makes good composition and what makes for a bad composition. But there's so much more that we can do. And what I'm going to be talking about now are basically different types of compositional structures that can work within these compositional rules and grids and so on. So we've got different support mechanisms that operate within these compositional frameworks, And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take some of my favorite artists and I'm going to analyze and really break down and dissect their artworks to see their approach and to see exactly their thought processes and demonstrate to you the importance of these compositional rules and structures. So yeah, let's take a look. Single point composition. This is a single point structure by the legend Frank Frazetta. It sits within a middle line composition setup. We're immediately drawn into the eyes, which rest along the vertical middle line. The eyes of the horse sit on the horizontal middle line, perhaps to retain a little attention. In terms of visual interest, there's some nice background depth with the eagle-type bird flying about the smoke. He uses lighter tones for them to suggest distance. There's also a strong silhouette, and the overall shape of the subject is very striking with a graphic composition that pulls the viewer in. This is another single point structure by Dave Raposa, which also seems to sit within a middle line composition. Once again, the eye happens to rest upon the vertical center line. There's power in this line. Could it be a coincidence that the hand also sits upon the horizontal center line? If we break down the shapes, we can see how it has a sense of symmetry with triangular angles from the head. A triangle represents power and stability, which complements the nature of the character in this illustration. Some asymmetry comes into play with the sword and the leg to add some variety and visual interest to the static, powerful pose. We see some contrast in the design shapes. They're consistent with a little variety thrown into parts which change the pace and rhythm of the design. The background clouds are deliberately positioned to act as leading lines that point to the subject's face. Although this is a middle line composition, we can see how the powerful rule of thirds comes into play. The face is positioned just below 2/3 of the way up from the middle. Multi-point composition. This is one of my favourite artists around today, Piotr Jablonski. In this image, he uses a multi-point structure which sits within a fusion of middle line and rule of thirds composition. The first point we see in the hierarchy is the man's face. We see him first because there's more contrast between the lights and the darks, and because he stands over one of the rule of third intersection points. The next face we see is the lady smoking a cigarette, who appears to be the main person in the frame, but the artist chose to introduce her second. She sits between two intersection points on the rule of thirds grid, and her eyes are perfectly aligned with the middle line. If you notice, the cross-section center for the horizontal and vertical middle lines intersect at the point of her cigarette, which is a sub-focus point. It always keeps her interest and attention coming right back to the center. Finally, we have the third main focus point, the man stood behind her. And so our interest fleets between these 3 points and the cigarette. Did you even notice how the smoke plays a pivotal role in linking all of these focus points together? This is just one of the ways in which the artist has added some visual interest to retain our attention and keep us in the image. He also uses some contrasting shapes and some leading lines to help frame the composition. This next image by Jessica Oyenar, a senior artist for Riot Games, demonstrates a multi-point structure within a middle line composition. Once again, we see the eye falls just on the vertical center line. Although this isn't a typical rule of thirds composition, if we break up the top half into thirds, we see how the eye is placed next to one of the intersection points. This demonstrates the power and the importance of thirds in general. The face is the main focus point due to the position, the contrast of lights and darks, unique colour of the eyes, and the amount of concentrated detail in that one particular space. The next focus point falls onto the curve of her figure, which suggests her sensual nature. The artist clearly wanted this idea to come across. Next, we're taken into the background where a fight occurs, then up to the moon and back around to the point where she's inflicting pain onto her victim. There's some sub-focus points below which help to frame the subject and keep our eyes from exiting the image. Some of these points can be argued in terms of the visual hierarchy, as they're subjective depending on the viewer. In terms of visual interest, there's a great sense of depth within this image. There's an emphasis of using blurs from the hand in the foreground through to the background fighters. The overlapping elements of the figures colliding help to add to this depth. There's a sense of accurate perspective, and the diagonals of the building adds tension and pace to the image. There's a very strong visual hierarchy overall. Framed composition. This next image is by the wonderful Carla Ortiz. It's a classically framed structure and seems to fit within the rule of thirds grid, although the main focus point, the face, is slightly to the right of the top left intersection. The rest of her body, however, sits across the lower left intersection. Her face has the highest contrast between the lights, darks, and detail in the smallest amount of space. This makes her face pop off the page. She's ultimately framed by crows, trees, and the steps which lead us into the backdrop. There's a great sense of depth in this image. The castle and the backdrop also helps the figure to stand out. The castle has less contrast between the lights and the darks, which suggests the distance. As a rule of thumb, things in the distance always appear to have less contrast between the lights and the dark areas due to atmospheric perspective. There's also a great sense of flow to the design of her outfit. This helps to guide the viewer past the crows and towards the steps after initially seeing her face. The trees in the far distance are merely suggested with pattern and colour. This ensures the focus and attention is retained within areas of importance, and it offers a place for the eyes to rest. It also helps the viewer to engage with the painting by filling in any details with their imagination. This image is also really well balanced. For example, the top left rectangle is quite busy, whereas the bottom right is more plain with darker tones, and they basically balance each other out. This image by Jakub Rosalski utilizes the rule of thirds. The focus point is on the lady in front on the left as she's placed on the lower left intersection. The vertical details in her skirt also help to draw in the viewer's attention. The main subject in the image is actually the central mech figure, which is framed by the cluster of bodies in the field, as well as the two mechs to the left and the right. The bright white light dot on the central mech also attracts our attention. The cluster of bodies seem to sit on the lower third of the image, and the height of the mech seems to finish around the second third of the image, once more reinforcing the power of thirds. The use of depth seems to be very common within images that are captivating, and we see it here once more with the use of foreground, midground, and far distant elements that merely suggest things for our brains to work out. Symmetrical composition. Symmetrical designs are less common today, but were very popular in older paintings and typically associated with religious works. Symmetry represents unity, balance, and the divine. This is The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. It utilizes a single point and symmetrical structure within a middle line composition. First thing we notice is the placement of Jesus, absolutely central to the image, as the rest of the figures are balanced along this middle line. Jesus is contrasted by the bright window behind him, which makes him pop out. The perspective lines all converge onto Jesus' face. When condensing the values, it appears as though the left side is a lot darker than the right side. This perhaps helps to balance the image. Obviously, the figures on either side appear different, which introduces asymmetry into the scene. And another older painting by Raphael, The School of Athens, adopts a mixture of single point, leading lines, and frame structure within a middle line composition. The vanishing point is in the background, somewhere at the beginning of the path that they're walking on. This is determined by the angles of other objects marked by the yellow lines. The pink lines show how the figures are framed within the image by surrounding objects. There's a variation of shapes of unity with variety in this image to give some overall visual interest. Path composition. This next image by Ethan Zahner utilizes a variety of compositional structures. Primarily, it utilizes the rule of thirds for the main focus point. The figure is the brightest part of the image, which makes it stand out even more. It's an extremely high contrast point. You can see how the golden ratio comes into play with the arrangement of elements within this scene. It's busier in the areas of focus, and the details gradually taper off. This is predominantly a single point composition, but it's fortified by a path-like set of structures. Various other points are littered around the main focus point. You could also argue that this is a framed type of structure, as we see the pink areas fully contain the main focus point. there's some really nice visual interest added. The straight and curved lines really go well together. The streamlined waterfalls help to separate and balance the rest of the scene within the darkness. There's also a leading line seen in blue. This shadow cuts directly into the scene and leads our eye straight to the main focus point. Another image here by Jakub Rosalski demonstrates some sound composition which seems to utilise a lot of the compositional rules. It's a fusion of the rule of thirds and the golden ratio with multiple focus points within it. The top main mech figure dominates the top left intersection, with the woman, who is second in the visual hierarchy, adds to the clump of details which ultimately captures your interest. With regards to the golden ratio, the busiest part of the image is the main left section, which then tapers off as we spiral out to get less and less details. The other two men riding horses form a path type of structure by becoming additional focus points. When we look at the image as a middle line structure, we can see some correlations within the horses placed at intersections. The middleman is next to the vertical middle line, and the top of the second horse's head is in line with the horizontal middle line, which also separates the land and the sky. The rider of the second horse is also placed on a rule of thirds intersection point. Overall, this image is visually interesting with a high level of depth and detail in certain areas. There's some overlapping elements, leading lines, and generally has a nice rhythm of busy and calm areas for the eye to rest. There's also contrast in the scene in terms of mood. We have a beautiful natural scene and setting that clashes with dangerous soldier type figures. Leading lines composition. Carlo Ortiz once again nails this painting with a solid composition. There's a sense of golden ratio that comes into play with the rule of thirds and arguably the middle line, which seems to separate the image into lights and darks. The composition is structured by that seem to frame the subject and the crew. This is also a single point structure, but the eye does seem to fleet across the crew members that help to frame the woman and keep the viewer from losing interest. Again, there's a nice sense of depth to the image for visual interest, and the suggestion of elements such as the mountains, ropes and sail aren't detailed at all, but they give just enough information to give them context within the image. This enables the details in the other areas that matter, such as the face, to speak louder. It keeps our focus on the face as we're always being pulled back into her gaze. This final image by Piotr Jablonski breaks all the rules. At first I couldn't quite work out what type of compositional rule was in play, but it dawned on me that this image represents something very odd and strange. If we try to lay over the top the typical compositional grid rules, nothing seems to correlate, yet it still works. Ultimately, this image relies on the compositional structures in play and not the compositional rules. The main structure used in this image are leading lines, which guide the eyes of the viewer to the main focus point, which is the figure by the window, but also attracts the viewer by being the brightest part of the image. This figure is placed in an odd position, in the way that he's floating and stuck to a wall in a part of the image where focus points just aren't really placed. However, it works. It lends to the idea of being paranormal by breaking conventions and deliberately made to appear odd. The main focus point is framed by the door on the left and the eerie shadow of a figure that looms off screen as if coming up some steps. This is a trick used to stimulate the viewer's imagination by opening up the scene outside of the frame. In terms of visual interest, it is very well balanced and there's plenty of unity with variety, many horizontal, vertical and diagonal lines that contrast each other. The colour palette is also limited but has a nice variety of colours within these limitations. So that's a lot of in-depth knowledge to take in and information, but it's a very useful understanding how to guide the viewer on a subconscious level. There's one thing to draw pretty images and drawings and make it look good, but having an intentional underlying structure that prompts your viewer to see it in a way that you want them to see it, I think is where the amateurs are separated by the professionals. You know, professionals obviously know how to captivate the viewer and utilizing the best possible composition and structure to convey that idea and sum it up. So yeah, hopefully all of these principles have been useful to you and you've learned a lot. So go forth and create many brilliant drawings with various compositions. You're more than welcome to sample the generator. There's a link in the description. It's a task-based generator that helps you to learn the principles outlined in this video by giving task-based incentives to draw various things, different compositional types and structures and so on. So check that out, and until next episode, I will see you later.